In the city of Westbridge, the streets were never completely quiet. Even late at night, there were usually cars passing through the main roads, distant traffic lights changing colors, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing along empty sidewalks. But between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., something about the city felt different, quieter, almost like the world itself was pausing for a moment before morning arrived. Most people were asleep during that hour, except for people like Daniel. Daniel worked the night shift at a small convenience store near the edge of downtown. His shift always ended at 2:45 a.m. after locking the store and turning off the lights. He usually walked home. It was a 20-minute walk through quiet streets. Simple. Routine. One cold November night, Daniel noticed something strange during his walk home. He was crossing Maple Street when he saw something ahead that made him slow down. A bus stop. That wasn't strange by itself. Westbridge had dozens of bus stops, but Daniel had walked this street almost every night for over a year, and he was certain of one thing. That bus stop had never been there before. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it more carefully. A metal bench, a small glass shelter, and a tall sign with the bus symbol on it. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. The sign above the shelter had no route number, just a blank white panel. Daniel stepped closer. The street around him was empty. No cars. No people. Just rows of dark buildings and quiet streetlights. He looked at his phone. 2:58 a.m., only 2 minutes before 3. Maybe they just installed it today, he muttered. But something about it still felt wrong. The metal looked old. The paint on the bench was slightly worn, like it had been there for years. Daniel sat down on the bench for a moment. The cold metal creaked softly under his weight. The street remained silent. Then the digital display above the shelter flickered on. Daniel hadn't noticed it before. A small screen attached to the bus stop sign. The numbers slowly appeared on the dark display. 3 o'clock right below the time. Another message appeared. Next bus arriving. Daniel frowned. He looked down the street. No headlights. No sound of an engine. Then the display changed again. 3 words appeared on the screen. Last route. Daniel felt a strange chill run down his back. He had never heard of a route called Last Route. The streetlights flickered once. The air suddenly felt colder. And far down the road, Daniel heard the sound of a bus engine. Slow. Heavy. Approaching through the empty street. Daniel stood up slowly. Something told him this bus wasn't part of the normal city routes. The sound of the engine grew louder. The headlights appeared around the corner, but something about them looked strange. Too dim. Too yellow. The bus slowly turned onto Maple Street. And as it approached the stop, Daniel noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The bus had no route number on the front, just a single word glowing faintly on the display. LASDN behind the dark windows. He thought he saw passengers sitting perfectly still, watching the street, watching him. The bus slowed as it approached the stop. Its engine made a deep, heavy rumbling sound that echoed through the empty street. Daniel stood a few steps away from the bench, watching carefully. Something about the bus felt wrong. Not broken, just old. The headlights were dim and yellow, like they belonged to a vehicle from another time. The metal sides of the bus looked faded, the paint scratched and worn. Even the windows looked strange. The glass was slightly fogged from the inside. The bus rolled to a stop directly in front of the shelter. The engine continued humming quietly. For several seconds, nothing happened. The doors stayed closed. The passengers inside didn't move. Daniel looked through one of the windows. He could see people sitting in the seats, but they were completely still. No one talking. No one looking at their phones. No one even turning their heads. They simply sat there, facing forward. Daniel felt uneasy. Public buses were never this quiet, even late at night. Then the front door of the bus slowly opened with a long metallic hiss. The interior lights flickered on. A pale yellow glow filled the front of the bus. Daniel could see the driver now, a man sitting behind the wheel, wearing a dark uniform and a cap. The driver looked straight at him without blinking, without speaking, just watching. Daniel hesitated. Is this a normal route? He asked. His voice sounded louder than he expected in the quiet street. The driver tilted his head slightly, as if thinking. Then he spoke. Last route. His voice was calm, but strangely flat, like he had repeated those same words many times before. Daniel frowned. Where does it go? The driver didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the small screen beside the steering wheel. Then he looked back at Daniel. Final stop, he said. Daniel felt a small chill. That's not really helpful, he replied. The driver slowly raised one hand and pointed inside the bus. You'll see. Daniel looked past the driver toward the rows of seats behind him. The passengers were still sitting there, silent, still, watching. The aisle. Daniel suddenly noticed something strange. The passengers looked different, not scary, just unusual. One man wore a suit that looked decades old. Another passenger had a coat style Daniel had only seen in old photographs. Even their hairstyles looked outdated. Daniel stepped a little closer to the open bus door. Is this some kind of night tour or something? He asked. The driver didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't react at all. Instead, he said something that made Daniel pause. This stop appears once each night. Daniel blinked. What? The driver pointed toward the bus stop behind Daniel. 3 o'clock, he said. Every night. Daniel turned around and looked at the shelter. It looked completely normal. Just a bench and a glass wall under a streetlight. He looked back at the driver. So, what happens if someone gets on? For the first time, the driver showed a faint expression. Not happiness, not anger, something closer to sadness. The route continues, he said quietly. Daniel looked inside the bus again, at the silent passengers. Where do they get off? He asked. The driver didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the digital display above the door. The screen changed again. New words appeared. Final BRNG. The driver turned his eyes back toward Daniel. You should decide. Behind him, the passengers remained perfectly still, watching the open door. Waiting. And Daniel suddenly had the strange feeling that this bus stop didn't appear for everyone walking the street. It appeared for people who were meant to see it. Daniel stood there, staring at the open bus door. The street around him remained completely empty. No cars passed. No people walked by. The only sound was the low rumble of the bus engine. Inside the bus, the passengers still hadn't moved. They sat quietly in their seats, facing forward. But Daniel could feel their attention, even though most of them weren't looking directly at. And it felt like they were waiting. Daniel took a slow step closer to the door. The interior lights flickered slightly above the aisle. The yellow glow made the inside of the bus look older than it should have. The seats were worn, the metal bars slightly rusted. Even the floor looked scratched and faded. Daniel leaned slightly to look further inside, and that's when he noticed something strange. There were more passengers than he first thought. At least 15 people, maybe more, all sitting in silence. One woman sat near the middle of the bus wearing a long gray coat. Her clothes looked like they were from another time, maybe the 1980 South. 2 seats behind her, a man wore a hat and jacket that looked even older. Something from decades ago. Daniel felt uneasy. Is this some kind of historical tour bus? He asked. The driver didn't answer. He simply watched Daniel with the same quiet expression. Then something happened that made Daniel freeze. One of the passengers slowly turned their head. A young man sitting near the back. He looked directly at Daniel. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe because he recognized him. "Wait," Daniel whispered. The man looked exactly like someone Daniel knew, a coworker from the convenience store. A guy named Marcus. Marcus had worked with Daniel about 6 months earlier, but he had suddenly stopped showing up to work, the manager said. Marcus had moved to another city. But the man sitting inside the bus looked exactly like him. Same face, same short haircut, same black jacket Marcus used to wear. Daniel stepped closer to the door. "Marcus?" He called. The man inside the bus didn't answer. He just stared at Daniel for a few seconds, then slowly turned his head back toward the front of the bus, like he hadn't heard him. Daniel looked back at the driver. "Do you know that guy?" he asked. The driver didn't react. Instead, he reached up and pressed a small button near the dashboard. A soft chime echoed through the bus. Then a mechanical voice came from the speakers above the aisle. "Next stop." The voice paused. "Unknown." Daniel frowned. "That's not a real stop," he said. The driver looked at him calmly. "All stops become unknown eventually." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Behind the driver, the passengers remained silent. But Daniel began noticing something else. Something he hadn't seen before. Not all of them looked the same age. Some looked young. Some looked much older, but their clothing styles came from different decades. One passenger wore something that looked like a uniform from the early 2000s. Another man wore a jacket that looked like it belonged in the 1970s. Daniel realized something disturbing. The bus looked old, but the passengers looked like they had come from different times. He looked again at the man, who looked like Marcus. Marcus had disappeared 6 months ago. And now he was sitting quietly inside a bus that appeared at 3 o'clock at a bus stop that hadn't existed before. Daniel slowly stepped backward away from the door. "This is weird," he said. "I think I'll just walk home." The driver didn't stop him, didn't argue, but just before Daniel turned away, the driver spoke again. "You saw the..." "Stop." Daniel paused. "That means you can see the route." Daniel frowned. "I want to see the route." The driver looked at him carefully. Then he said something that made Daniel's chest tighten. "You already did." Behind him, the digital screen above the bus stop changed again. New words appeared. Next, Daniel suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that the bus hadn't stopped there by accident. It had stopped for him. Daniel slowly stepped back from the open bus door. Cold air of the street felt heavier. Now, like the entire block had grown quieter. Too quiet. He glanced down the road. The streetlights stretched into the distance, lighting the empty sidewalk. Everything looked normal. Just another quiet night in the city. But behind him, the bus engine was still running. Daniel turned around again. The driver hadn't moved. He was still sitting behind the wheel, watching Daniel with the same calm expression. The door of the bus remained open. Waiting. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not getting on," he said. The driver nodded slowly. "As you wish." Daniel waited for the bus door to close, for the vehicle to pull away, for everything to return to normal. But nothing happened. The bus didn't move. The engine kept humming quietly. The passengers inside remained completely still. Daniel looked at the digital display above the bus stop again. The message had changed. Waiting, a strange feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. "Why is it still here?" he asked. The driver leaned slightly toward the door. "The route cannot continue," he said, "until a choice is made." Daniel frowned. "What choice?" The driver didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the empty seat near the front of the bus. "You may board." Daniel crossed his arms. "I already said I'm not getting On. The driver nodded again. Then the stop will remain. Daniel looked around the street again. The buildings dot the sidewalks. The quiet road dot. Everything looked the same dot, but something felt different. The air had grown colder, and the silence had become deeper. Daniel checked his phone. 3:07. A 7 minutes had passed since the bus arrived, but it felt much longer. Then he noticed something else. The street looked emptier. Not just quiet. Empty. The traffic lights at the next intersection had stopped changing. They were frozen on red. Daniel stepped away from the bus stop and walked a few steps down the sidewalk. He looked around the corner. The rest of the city street was dark, much darker than before. When he turned back toward the bus stop, his chest tightened. The street behind him looked different. The buildings seemed dim. Almost like the world outside the bus stop was fading. Daniel walked quickly back toward the shelter. "What's happening?" he asked. The driver looked at the clock above the windshield. "Time moves differently here," he said. Daniel felt a chill. "What do you mean here?" The driver slowly gestured around the bus stop. "The stop exists between moments," he said. Daniel stared at him. "That doesn't make sense." The driver gave a small, tired smile. "Most routes don't." Inside the bus, one of the passengers suddenly moved. A woman sitting near the middle slowly turned her head. Her eyes met Daniel's. For a moment, Daniel felt something strange. Not fear. Something closer to recognition. Like the passengers inside the bus had once stood exactly where he was. Now at the bus stop. 3 o'clock. The woman slowly looked toward the empty seat near the front, then back at Daniel. The message on the digital display changed again. Last. Daniel looked at the driver. "What happens if I just walk away?" The driver's answer was quiet. "You can. Try." Daniel looked down the empty street again. The darkness beyond the bus stop seemed thicker. Now, almost like the rest of the city had disappeared. And suddenly Daniel understood something. The bus stop didn't appear in the city. The city had disappeared around the bus stop, and the only way for the night to continue was for someone to choose. Daniel stood under the dim streetlight, staring at the open bus door. The city around him no longer looked like the city he knew. The streetlights were still there. The buildings were still there. But everything beyond the bus stop felt distant. Faded. Like the world outside. This small stretch of road had been paused. The bus engine continued its slow, steady rumble. Inside, the passengers sat quietly in their seats. Still. Watching. Daniel looked at them carefully again. The woman who had turned toward him earlier slowly looked back toward the front of the bus. The man who looked like Marcus still sat near the back, staring forward. None of them spoke. None of them tried to leave. Daniel stepped closer to the bus door again. "Where does the route go?" he asked. The driver answered calmly, "Forward." "That's not helpful." The driver rested one hand on the steering wheel. "The route doesn't go to places," he said. "It goes to moments." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" The driver pointed gently toward the passengers. "They boarded at different stops," he explained. "Different nights. Different years." Daniel looked at the people inside the bus again. The different clothes suddenly made more sense. Different decades. Different times. "What happens to them?" Daniel asked quietly. The driver looked straight ahead at the road. "They continue." "For how long?" The driver didn't answer. The silence inside the bus felt heavier now. The soft hum of the engine echoed through the empty street. Then Daniel noticed something new. At the very back of the bus, One seat was empty. Just one. He slowly pointed toward it. Why is that seat empty? The driver followed his gaze. Then he looked back at Daniel. The route always leaves space, he said. Daniel felt a chill run through him. For what? The driver's answer was simple. For the next stop. Daniel looked back at the digital display above the shelter. The high screen flickered again. New words appeared. Departianji. Daniel's heart began beating faster. Wait, he said. Didn't get on. The driver slowly reached for the door controls. The stop only appears once each night, he said. The bus door began to close. Daniel stepped back quickly. Wait. The driver paused. The door stopped halfway. Close. Daniel looked inside the bus one more time. At the silent passengers. At the empty seat in the back. At the man who looked like Marcus. Then Daniel looked down the street. The darkness beyond the bus stop was slowly fading. The real city lights were returning. Cars in the distance. Normal street sounds. The world was coming back. Daniel stepped away from the door. I'll walk, he said quietly. The driver studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Very well. The door closed completely. The bus slowly pulled away from the curb. Its headlights moved down the empty street. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared around the corner. The street became quiet again, but this time it felt normal. Daniel looked back at the bus stop. The shelter was gone. The bench was gone. The sign had vanished. Only an empty sidewalk remained under the street. Daniel stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what had happened. Then he noticed something strange, something small, on the sidewalk. Where the bus stop had been, there was a faded marking on the concrete, almost worn away. A circle with a tiny symbol inside. A bus. And below it, very faint numbers. 300. Daniel never saw the bus stop again. He walked the same route home every night, for months, for years. But sometimes, when he finished work very late, and the city streets were completely empty, he thought he heard something in the distance. The sound of a bus engine. Slowly approaching.